have noticed we have Dr. Downing's book on the goddess and her brand new book, Journey Through Menopause. Dr. Downing has been a longtime member of the Friends of Jung, long before I moved here. She's a chairwoman, what do we say today, of the religion department at SDSU. She was the first woman president elected to the Academy of Religion. And she has a third book, a brand new book that's coming out, she tells me, perhaps in a month, which certainly the bookshop will have, which is a long-awaited sequel to this one. It's entitled Psyche's Sister. So it's my great pleasure to introduce Dr. Christine Downing. Dr. Downing?
Thank you, Ellie. I'm delighted to be back here again. I can remember so well that many of the chapters that ended up in the book on the goddess were first presented here to the Friends of Jung in San Diego. And as I was thinking about what I might say this evening, as I want to present a more recent interest of mine, Egyptian mythology, I was recalling how when I had finished that book on the Greek goddesses, that I was so aware of feeling myself to be remembered, feeling that I had come to a kind of completion. And then, awfully soon afterwards, discovering that, of course, that completion was simply the basis of a new beginning. And one of the things that I found as I remember months of finishing that book, was that I began writing some of the papers that are in the menopause book, and discovering that there were Greek goddesses that it was important for me to attend to that I had not attended to at the time that I was working on that goddess book, and particularly the goddess Hestia, the goddess of home, the goddess of the ordinary and the everyday. And I also found, soon after I'd finished that book, that although that book had been initiated by a dream which sent me in search of her, and that I'd initially understood her to, of course, be a divine figure, a goddess, that I was now discovering that although that was true, that she was also the actual human female or females, not just myself, but those sisters that I find myself directly involved with and having to struggle in relationship to. And that's really what led to that book on the sisters that will be published a month or so from now. And then I also discovered that I needed to turn to the goddesses of Egypt, that somehow working with the Greeks had represented a kind of wholeness, but that there was something further to do. And yet, initially, the pull to Egypt felt quite accidental. I've come, and this is one of the things I want to share this evening, to understand that pull as representing a really deep, unconscious necessity. But initially, it began very simply. The woman that I live with was writing a novel. She was longing for some female mythological figure that might represent some of the dark, destructive energies. A kind of devil figure, but different from the Christian devil. And one day, as she was sharing this concern with her father, he said, "You know, maybe the Egyptian goddess Sekhmet might be the figure that you're looking for." And so she and I started getting out all our mythology books and reading up about Sekhmet, and found ourselves fascinated. And then she said, maybe in order to really discover, really come to understand the energy that this deity, who is a lion-headed goddess, represents, Perhaps we should have a cat. And I said, oh no, we couldn't possibly have a cat. I'm allergic. And so we decided we couldn't. But as happens in these kinds of instances, a cat found us that we couldn't resist and whom we named Sekhmet. And that winter, as we tried to think of where we might take our first trip together, it seemed important to go to a place that neither of us had ever been before, to go to a place that would be new for each of us. And somehow, almost inevitably, we decided on Egypt. And of course, as I prepared to go to Egypt, I knew that one of the things that would interest me would be the goddesses of Egypt. And I think that initially, what I had imagined happening was really a kind of continuation of the illumination and the challenging of my knowledge of myself and my understanding of human, feminine possibility that the Greek goddesses had provoked. I thought in a way that it would just be a larger, more complex, more extended version of the kind of thing that I'd already explored. But I found that Egypt gave me something different. That what has become more important than the particular deities of Egypt is the very different level of consciousness that Egyptian mythology introduces us to. When we went to Egypt, we went to Karnak. And I remember still so vividly going there at the time of the winter solstice and facing the entryway to the temple. I don't know if any of you have been there or have seen pictures that will remind you of the way in which at that entryway you find yourself confronting gate, and behind it another gateway, and behind it another gateway, and just gate beyond gate beyond gate. And at the time of the solstice, the sun is rising exactly between all those gates that you're looking through. Absolutely stunning experience. And I somehow had such a deep sense as I was there of being at the place where humans had first left enduring evidence of their response to the divine. I felt myself to be at the place of beginnings. And that really has been my sense of what Egypt means to me, that it somehow incarnates a connection to beginnings, to a level of our consciousness that is deeper, more primary than any other that I've been exposed to. I know, of course, that literally Egypt is not really the beginning, that there were human cultures long before the culture of Pharaonic Egypt, which starts around 3500 BCE. But for me, at least for now, this is the next place, the earlier place to go to. And one of the things one of the images that this experience evokes for me is a dream that Jung retells in Memories, Dreams, Reflections. It's one of the most likely to be familiar dreams in the whole volume. You remember, it's the dream in which really first introduces him to the notion of the collective unconscious. That dream of proceeding from the first floor of his own house through to the cellar, and then to another cellar, and then to another cellar. And as he's doing that, as he's going down, 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 deeper into the earth, moving from one layer of civilization to an earlier level and to an earlier one, and so on. And I've had such a sense as I've made my way from our world to Greece and now to Egypt of making a very similar kind of journey. And one of the things that I've become so aware of is that what Egyptian mythology, that what the Egyptian goddesses teach, that I'm not sure that what they teach is really still psychology, or that it's really about the feminine in any immediately human way. But rather that what is important about these goddesses, this mythology, is that it initiates us into a different consciousness, a consciousness that represents a different relationship to our bodies, to our species, to all forms of life, to our planet, to death, and to endings. And what I want to try and share here this evening are these dimensions of this mythology. I want to focus on that mythology, although towards the end, I'm also going to speak about some of the particular goddess figures that were important in ancient Egyptian mythology. And the aspects of this consciousness that are so different from the kind of consciousness that we're most familiar with, the kind of consciousness that underlies, that evokes, that energizes even Greek mythology. Some of these different features are, first, the way in which the Egyptians, through all stages of the development of their religion and mythology, continued to revere the divine in natural forms, particularly in various forms of animal life. I want to spend some time talking about that. I also want to spend some time talking about the peculiar fluidity of Egyptian mythology and the great multiplicity of divinities that are part of it. And I want to talk about the understanding of death that the Egyptians held. And these are all aspects of Egyptian mythology that the Greeks initially found disturbing, bewildering, and strange, and then tried as quickly as they could to deny, because they were so foreign. That the Greeks did their best when they became exposed to Egyptian mythology to transpose it into familiar terms and to very quickly say, oh, well, Isis is really Demeter and Hathor is really Aphrodite, and so on. And trying to ignore precisely the ways in which Egyptian mythology is different, precisely the things that I would like to highlight here. So first, I want to talk a little bit about the importance of the animal forms in Egyptian mythology. Seems to be the case in Egypt, and this is not really unique to Egypt at all, that the very first beings that were worshipped were various creatures of the natural world. hawks, baboons, ibises, jackals, vultures, cobras, hippopotamuses, crocodiles, any number of animals that were part of the natural world. The goddesses in ancient Egypt were not goddesses of the earth, but as was also true in old Europe, were goddesses of the sky and were primarily represented as or seen as birds, and various snakes. All right, so the first thing I'm trying to say is simply that originally the word for the divine in Egypt, neter, N-T-R, seems to have referred to banners that the Egyptians carried in processions or put at the outside of their temples. And on these banners were drawn these various creatures of the natural world who seemed so clearly to the Egyptians to be that which provokes our reverence, our awe, that which represents the divine. Then, around 3,500 or so, maybe around 3,000, at about the time that Egypt became unified, at the time of the first dynasty, for the very first time, human-shaped gods appear in Egypt. And these seem to have been very much associated with the political unification, with the attempt to stabilize the monarchy, the succession, and so on. Now, what happens then is that from this point onward, we have in Egypt something that doesn't, as far as I know, happen anywhere else, which is that the appearance of human-shaped goddesses and gods does not replace the animal-shaped deities that had been there before. But rather, we now have animal deities, human-shaped deities, and also those hybrid forms that are probably among the most characteristic features of Egyptian mythology. Those many beautiful representations of a human body with the head of a ram, or the head of a lion, or the head of a cow, or whatever. But the main thing that I'm trying to express here is that in Egypt, these three different ways of representing the divine all coexist. The animal forms persist after the introduction of the human forms. There's no sense that one appropriately replaces the other. That there was a deep sense among the Egyptians that each of these are equally valid ways of representing the divine. That none of these is understood to be a truer representation. So that, for instance, one of the goddesses that I want to talk about some towards the end, the one that I'm actually wearing here on this pendant, Hathor, is a goddess who, throughout Egyptian history, is represented sometimes as a cow. In fact, one of the most beautiful representations of her that I can think of at the moment is one at Hatshepsut's temple, where she's represented as a cow, and this female pharaoh is kneeling underneath her body, sucking at her udder. But Hathor is also represented sometimes just as a very beautiful young woman, and other times represented as a cow with a human face, or as a human-like figure with the face of a cow, or perhaps just the ears of a cow, as in this pendant. And each one of those representations is seen as equally valid, equally true, equally necessary. And I think that this is one of the ways in which the Egyptians communicate that they never lose sight of the power, the transcendence, the divinity of the natural world. That for the Egyptians, that sense of the division, the gap, the separation between the human and the natural, which is such an important part of the Hebrew Christian perspective, which seems to be so clear in the way in which the Egyptian deities come to be separated from the earlier animal forms that they too had once been associated with. That's something that doesn't happen in Egypt. There is, for instance, not even in Egyptian mythology, a special story about the creation of human beings. There's simply a sense that we are part of the natural world. And I think that one of the things, and this is something I want to really focus on at the very end this evening, that one of the things that this signifies, as I understand it, is that there's a profound recognition that even those things about our species that are most peculiar to us, that are most distinctive to us, are part of our natural being, are part of what connects us to the natural world. They're simply our way of being part of the natural world. The other thing that I wanted to mention here as part of this peculiar consciousness in Egypt is the fluidity that we find in Egyptian mythology. I think this is one of the reasons that Egyptian mythology is rarely looked at from a psychological perspective, because it is very hard to get hold of anything that stays in place. That there's something about Egyptian mythology and this fluidity that attracts us because we recognize it as having a kind of truth that, at least in our dream life, we're very familiar with, but that the kind of organizing, ordering energy that's such an important part of our trying to make sense of things doesn't know what to do with. So we're pulled to it and we're repelled by it. But there's a lot about Egyptian mythology that seems to resist interpretation. And what I have in mind here is the way in which the Egyptians seem to have delighted in multiplicity and multiplication. The way there is in Egypt no fixed final form for any of the divinities. This is one of the reasons why any of the handbooks on Egyptian mythology are so unsatisfying and so inadequate, because they try to stabilize it. They try to say, this is what Isis is like, or this is what Hathor is like, or this is what Osiris was like. and ignore the way in which Isis and Hathor at times blend, the way in which the kinds of distinctions between this deity and that deity that would make us comfortable were not really part of the way in which the Egyptians understood their gods and goddesses. For the Egyptians, there was such a sense that life means change, that life means being in process, life means diversity. The other side of this is that for the Egyptians, the stable, the permanent, the fixed is associated with death, with non-being. So that if their divinities were alive, that absolutely meant to the Egyptians that they were always still in process, always changing, always still in motion. That for them, life begins with creative differentiation. That oneness is before life. If there is, there's always two. So that even when they spoke of their land, it was always the two lands. It was the north and south conjoined. Or they spoke of the Nile and its fertile valley and the desert. But always at least two. But beyond that, for the Egyptians, duality was for them but simply the first version of plurality. Their real sense was a plurivocal rather than a dualistic conception. So that one of the things that we see in Egyptian mythology is ever increasing plurality. In other traditions, we see a move from the plural, from the multiple, towards unification. In Egypt, it gets more complicated rather than simpler. That when the Egyptians, for instance, recognize a connection between two of their deities, that doesn't issue for them in the sense of, oh, that means there's really only one. The absolute opposite happens. That when they recognize, for instance, that there is a connection between Re and Osiris, their sense is that that means there is Re and there is Osiris, and then there is also this composite being, Re Osiris. And so instead of having moved from 2 to 1, we've moved from 2 to 3. So that there is a real delight in variety rather than in fixity. There is, for instance, in this connection between Re, who was a god of the sky, and Osiris, who was the god of the underworld. I'm sorry, Re is the god of the sun, and Osiris is the god of the underworld. And the Egyptians had a sense that every night, the sun, of course, sets and enters the underworld until morning, when the sun will rise again. And one of the ways in which the Egyptians imaged this was that at sunset, Re and Osiris become one. And then when morning comes, Re has to somehow struggle and it's never sure he would succeed, of course, struggle to get free of that and to become once again the separate being, Ray. Now, one of the things that I hope to communicate is that this kind of consciousness that's so characteristic of the Egyptians is a kind of consciousness that we also are familiar with. That, for instance, in our dreams, it seems to me, we're all familiar with figures who, on waking, as we begin to try to identify who that figure in the dream was, that we begin by saying, for instance, "That was my sister." "Oh no, it's my neighbor friend that I have coffee with every morning." And yet in the dream, there was just one figure, and it felt very much like one person, right? And yet in waking life, we realize how now we're left with, now there's a new being, right? There's still my sister, and there's still my neighbor, but there's this other combined form that means something different than either of them apart from one another do. Now, part of what I'm trying to communicate here is that the Egyptians valued the truth, the power of these different appearances, and wanted to honor that plurality, that variety, rather than to cut it down and try to reduce it to the more abstract, unified version. A real celebration among the Egyptians of the plural and of the concrete. That they were always adding on. Another thing that I think provides a good example of this is if you try to recall some of the pictures of Egyptian temples that you may have seen and compare them with the beautiful, classically harmonious, simple shape of a Greek temple, like at Delphi or at Sunion. In Egypt, not just at Karnak, but in just about any of their temples, what you have is every pharaoh adding on to the temple, and making it a more and more complicated kind of pattern. So that there's always addition and expansion, rather than reducing, abandoning, unifying. That the various gods or goddesses are represented, are understood as being manifest in the world in a great variety of different ways. So that Hathor is not only the cow that I was describing her as being a few moments ago, but also the hippopotamus, the sycamore, the lioness. That Nut is a cow, is the sky, is a roof, is a heavenly ocean, and so on. And it's as though the only way to adequately represent this particular pattern of divine energy is to validate all these different forms as being true expressions. So I wanted to stress this fluidity, this delight in multiplicity, this aversion from the abstract and the unifying. And then there's one other general comment I want to make about Egyptian mythology, and that is their understanding of death, their attitude toward death, their rather peculiar way of bringing together the permanent and the changing. And their attitude towards death also relates to this delight in life and variety, to which I've already alluded. Their aversion towards fixity. Because one of the things that we discover in Egyptian mythology is that although they celebrate long-lastingness, there is in Egypt no abstract sense of eternity. They hoped that their pyramids would last for a very, very long time, for a time almost beyond the scope of the human imagination. And so they have. But they never imagined that they would last forever, because they really didn't have a conception of forever. And indeed, the Egyptians, and this may seem strange to us, were persuaded that even their gods would die. That the scale of life of deities is far, far greater than the scale of human life. But it does encompass death. It's a different time scale, but it's not eternity. It's not forever. The Egyptians also, and we know this, had a tremendous interest in the continuity of human life after the end of our particular physical existence here. And this seems to have been not because they were afraid of death, but because they found life here so beautiful that they hoped to extend it longer. And yet, they had no sense that there is any survival of our personness, any kind of soul survival, apart from some physical substratum. They also had no sense that the longing for continued life meant a longing for a fixed form of life. So that the Egyptians, as they tried to imagine what kind of ongoingness might be available to us humans, had no sense that there was one permanent future life for us. There were a variety of ways in which we might still be present in the world. We might be present still in that mummy that lived in the tomb, along with all those other reminders of the kinds of artifacts that had sustained our physical life earlier. We might also be present in other life forms and even have a home up among the stars in the sky, but no notion of a single enduring soul. And indeed, the image of what happens after death for us humans that seemed to have the most power for the Egyptians was associated with Osiris. And what Egyptians most devoutly hoped was that after their death, they might become Osiris. And one of the most important rituals that Egyptians tried to participate in during their lifetime was to make a pilgrimage to Abydos for the sake of ensuring that after death, this might be their destiny. But I think it's important for us to know what the Egyptians meant by this hope of becoming Osiris. They were buried on the left side of the Nile, the sunset side of the Nile. And part of that was out of the hope that they might thereby go on into the underworld as the sun does in the evening. And that this would mean that they might hope that as the sun rises, they too might rise and be carried up into the upper world and there join the stars. So that was one of their hopes. But the deeper hope, or the one that seems to me to have been the more powerful and more central, was the one that was associated with joining Osiris in the underworld. And I want to try to describe what this seems to have meant by trying to suggest here one of the favorite Egyptian images for Osiris. And that was an image which represents this god wrapped up like a mummy, lying sideways, and then from his body there emerge stalks of grain. And I think that if you have that image in mind, you'll have a sense that what the Egyptians were hoping when they were imagining becoming Osiris was that from their bodies too, other forms of life might grow. Now, they represented this in this very concrete image. We, with our proclivity for more abstract ways of putting things, might describe this more in terms of something like wanting to participate in the ongoing life of the natural world, you know? But they saw it, as I said, much more, you know, in these very concrete images of becoming the vegetal growth, becoming part of the rising Nile, becoming part of the rising sun. But very much this sense of, again, this intimate connection with the natural world. Now, having said that, I want to talk just very briefly about the importance of goddesses in Egypt. We can save some of this for the question period afterwards. I do want to say that goddesses were a very important feature of Egyptian religion, much more important than a lot of the books about Egyptian mythology often suggest. This is true here, as it's true in so many ancient traditions. That the most ancient deities in Egypt seem to have been goddesses, the goddesses associated with those many, many local nomes or villages, all up and down the Nile. However, and I've become very fascinated by some of those goddesses, but I do want to say that one of the things that I have learned is that these goddesses do not serve as models for our own struggles in the way that the Greek ones do. They don't seem to work very well as representations of aspects of our own psyche, nor as personal presences. That the Egyptians had no sense of a person-to-person relationship between their deities and individual humans. They have no myths about connections between humans and mortals like the Greeks do, like the connection between Athena and Odysseus, or Aphrodite and Helen, or Zeus and any of his mortal mistresses. realm of the divine, the realm of the transcendent, was for the Egyptians through our relationship to the natural world and through the pharaohs. But it wasn't that kind of personal relationship that we are used to. That they were not seen as providing any kind of specific assistance. They didn't issue any divine commands. The Egyptians saw us as living our human lives dependent on the performance of ritual and on the exercise of our human wisdom. We don't get that kind of direct intervening help from the deities. Now, there are lots of important goddesses. The Egyptians seem to have seen the first divine being, the source of everything, as a goddess, Neith, who was associated with the primeval abyss out of which everything grows. There's also Nut, that sky goddess that I spoke of earlier, who is the mother and the daughter of most of the other important deities. There is Isis. I'm not going to speak about Isis at any great length now, but we may want to talk about her when we get to the question and answer period. But I do want to say one thing about Isis, which is that the Isis and Osiris myth is probably the Egyptian myth that's most likely to be familiar to us. And the reason for that is that this is a myth that was retold by the Greco-Roman author Plutarch. And the version of Isis that we tend to know is his version. And it's a version that sees her in a very human-like kind of way, that focuses on that moving story about how her devotion to her husband and her son, and that is told in a way that lends itself easily to allegorical interpretations, whether they be in terms of nature, fertility kinds of concerns, or whether they be the kinds of allegorical interpretations that see Isis in relationship to Jungian archetypes. Isis lends herself to psychological interpretation in a way that Egyptian mythology generally doesn't. But that is mostly because we're not really looking at Isis as the ancient Egyptians knew her. We're looking at Isis as she has been brought to us by way of the Greco-Roman world. The goddess that I want to just tell a little bit about here at the end is the goddess that led me to Egypt to begin with, the goddess Sekhmet. Sekhmet is one of the, you remember I was saying earlier, the way in which these goddesses all move in and out of one another. And I guess before I talk directly about Sekhmet, I want to just say a word or two about Hathor, that goddess to whom I've already referred several times this evening. Because Sekhmet, at least according to some traditions, is simply one aspect of Hathor. That sometimes Sekhmet is a separate deity, and sometimes she's seen as part of Hathor, or Hathor in one of her moods. Hathor, so I want to talk about Hathor in her primary manifestation as a goddess of love and beauty, and also in her Sekhmet aspect, which is an aspect in which she is a goddess of destruction. Hathor is one of those very, very ancient Egyptian deities who existed long before there were pharaohs in Egypt, and who later comes to be identified with just about every one of the local goddesses, and also associated with all the major national goddesses, Mut, Bast, Isis, and Sekhmet, and so on. There were more shrines to Hathor than to any other deity in Egypt. She was a creatrix who was always represented as conceiving, creating, and rearing. One of the things that happens in Egyptian mythology, because of that fluidity that I was talking about earlier, is that Hathor is the mother of her father, because she's the mother of her father, and she's, of course, obviously also the daughter of her father. She's the goddess of love and pleasure, of beauty and art, of the vine and of joy. She's especially associated with nurturance, with the nurturant wild cow, and I've described already the way in which she's represented. She was also, more than any of the other Egyptian goddesses, preeminently a goddess of women. And that's probably why she was so important to the female pharaoh, Hatshepsut. And I've already described that beautiful scene at Hatshepsut's temple where Hatshepsut is nursing at Hathor's udders. She was the goddess of childbirth, the goddess also who offered her milk-filled breasts to the newly dead and carries them on her back into the underworld. But in one of her aspects, she was known as Sekhmet, Sekhmet the powerful. And as Sekhmet, she was terrifying. Sekhmet was seen as a daughter of Ra, the sun god. And she was identified particularly with the scorching power of the noonday sun, and most often represented as a lion-headed, human-like female, although she also sometimes appears as a crocodile. Now, Sekhmet was known as the Eye of Ra, and her primary role was as the defender of the divine order. So she is placed on Ra, the sun god who represents the divine order. She's placed as the serpent on his brow, and she herself is often represented as wearing the solar disk, which means that she's, embodying that kind of power, the power that rules the world. As the Eye of Ra, Sekhmet was also imaged as a creator figure. One of the stories, one of the Egyptian creation myths, says that on one occasion, Sekhmet had gone off to have an adventure of her own. And then Ra sent one of his messengers to say, Sekhmet, you've got to come back and do all those things that I need you to do. And upset and disappointed at this recall, Sekhmet weeps. And we humans grew from those tears that she shed on that occasion. And I see that as one of the ways in which the Egyptians are trying to communicate their sense that somehow Sekhmet is associated with the tragic dimension of human existence. Now, the story about Sekhmet that I want to use as my ending to this presentation is a story about a time when the god Ra, who, like all Egyptian gods, is liable to aging, has become an old man. And the poems go on to really describe this aging, to describe him as incontinent, dribbling from his mouth, crippled, senile, powerless. And it turns out that we human beings come to know of his weakness and his vulnerability. And so we decide to plot against him, plot to be free of being ruled by the gods. Naturally, Ra and the other gods can't countenance this. And so Ra sends his eye in the shape of his lioness daughter, Sekhmet, to subdue the rebellion that these humans have instigated. And so Sekhmet is initially sent to do her destructive work in order to restore the balance between the divine and the human. But the trouble is that she gets carried away with her own bloodthirstiness. When I slay men, my heart rejoices, she proclaims. And it turns out that having tasted human blood, she will not be appeased. And then, as the other gods begin to recognize that Sekhmet is going from one village to another, devouring all the humans that she comes across, they realize that this has gone too far, that somehow she has to be stopped. Because she seems prepared to annihilate all humankind. And all that Ra had sent her to do was to uphold the divine order, to restore the balance. So the gods get together and they come up with a plan. And what they do is to gather together hundreds of enormous urns and fill them with beer mixed with pomegranate juice, and set them in the field where Sekhmet is going about her destructive work. And she comes upon one of these urns and looks in it and sees the red fluid and takes it for more blood. And she picks it up and tips it and starts swallowing it. Ah, more blood, she says. And she looks and discovers that there is another urn and another urn and another urn. And still gloating, she swallows them all. And of course, eventually, she falls asleep in a drunken stupor. And when she wakes, she's come back to her senses. She's been restored to her more Hathor-like nature. Now, sometimes Sekhmet is spoken of as an evilly destructive goddess. But I think that is to misunderstand this story. And I'm particularly persuaded of that when I remember what those many statues of Sekhmet look like. We have one in our living room that we brought back with us. One of the things that strikes me about the representations of Sekhmet, the lion-headed goddess, is one sees her power, but one also sees, at least when I look at her, not evil in her countenance, but rather an acceptance of the death-bringing energy that sometimes possesses her as integral to her nature, as part of who she is. And I see on her face a kind of look of someone who sees the irreducible tragedy of life, which she can do nothing to avert, and which indeed she knows she has herself helped bring about. but who does not hide from the pain. And I find in this myth about Sekhmet, a powerful reminder of the importance of coming to terms with destructive energy. The dark side of the Greek goddesses is comparatively so muted, so human scale, so much easier for us to acknowledge and integrate. But I see Sekhmet as reminding us that there are darker energies in us as humans, as natural beings, but also as helping us to recognize that these darker energies are natural ones, not pure evil or satanic, but part of a whole, as Sekhmet is part of Hathor. And I see us humans, as in so many ways like Sekhmet, with her initially creative energies so fearfully out of hand. And I mourn what we may do. The Egyptians, as I've been trying to say this evening, knew that everything eventually comes to an end, even the gods, even the Ba that survives the death of the body. For them, endlessness was itself death, non-existence. Yet they also loved life, ordinary daily life in this world, loved it so passionately that they did everything they could to extend it, even after death. The tombs, the funerary temples, the elaborate death cult, all mark a celebration of life. The exposure to Egyptian mythology has taught me, I think this is the main thing that it means to me, that energies natural to us and beautiful in themselves. And I'm thinking here of our human urge to know, our human urge to change, our human urge to transform. That these creative, beautiful energies can, when they get out of hand, become woefully destructive. And that Egyptian recognition that all things come to an end has taught me that accepting that we, as a species, may die means celebrating the beauty of our everyday life here, living it as fully and creatively and gratefully as we are able. I remember Atum telling Osiris that after all the familiar world is destroyed, and the Egyptians believed that that would happen, that Osiris would still remain. And I think I understand what that means. Having seen the peace garden at Nagasaki in bloom, where it was said that nothing would grow for a century, having seen the moss reappear almost miraculously at Mount St. Helens within a year of the volcano's eruption, I have a deep and to me comforting assurance that there will still be life, even if no longer human life, on this beautiful planet that has been our home, no matter what we might do. What the Egyptians recognized as their, transcendent to us, that natural world, would still persist, albeit changed in forms we might not recognize. To celebrate life, the Egyptians knew, means not holding on to the forms of it immediately given. I bless what I have learned from those who lived near the beginning that helps me to understand what it is like to live near what may be an ending.
What was your perception when you were in Egypt? How did modern day Egyptians relate to this sense of the all-encompassing nature and so forth? Do they still feel the same way, or the difference?
I don't really know, Eleanor, because I didn't really we weren't traveling in a way where we really got to meet Egyptians and, and talk with them in that kind of way. I guess I would have two parts of an answer that I don't even know if they're not even answers, but I mean they're relevant in some way or other. One is that one of the things that really struck me, and I think it strikes almost anyone who goes to Egypt, is the way in which in Egypt you get that sense that a place that was once recognized as holy continues to be recognized as holy, no matter what the official religion is, so that the sites of those ancient Egyptian temples then became Christian temples and are now places of Muslim worship, and that's just striking. And it's very clear in that culture, as in many other cultures, that some of the old things that were being celebrated and revered and so on in those places are still honored and recognized and known, even though the language that's being used and the rituals that are being performed on the outside look very different. You have a real sense of a kind of continuity in that way. The other thing was that River and I and her father were very moved by the guide that we had during the time that we took the boat trip down the Nile. An Egyptian who loved those stories. I mean, and was a wonderful storyteller, and who could, read the reliefs and read the paintings and just tell us the stories and knew all those divinities and so on. And all of that was very alive to him, and yet he was also a Muslim, and so his way of understanding the stories is a little different from mine, because he was always trying to bring them into a kind of unity. I mean, always trying to say, well, these were sort of manifestations of the one God, so that it was not the way of understanding those deities that had existed in that older time. But as I said, I don't really know very much about contemporary Egyptians. Yeah?
Your mention of infinity and your ontological expression about that, I'm confused a little bit. If you say that their religions, the expression of them, that they did not see man or the process of man as going into eternity, so they have no concept of eternity, or did you say that, do they have a concept of eternity from your point of view?
My sense is no. And let me recommend a book to you that agrees with me, and I think that takes the time to elaborate this in a really careful way. It's by Eric Hornung, and it's called The One and the Many. And some of you may have seen another essay of his in spring, I think it was about a year ago. And in introducing that essay, Jim Hillman said something or other to the effect that this is the one Egyptologist whose work he was familiar with, that he felt really understood the heart of what Egyptian mythology was all about. But Hornung, who has training to be able to deal directly with the Egyptian hieroglyphic material and so on in a way that I clearly don't. I mean, I'm dependent on the work of other scholars, and then my sort of relating that to my intuitions as to which of those scholars is is on the wavelength that feels right to me. You know, I'm not an expert in, you know, in being able to do primary source kind of work with Egyptian materials at all. But Hornung is absolutely clear that the Egyptians had no sense of eternity, that's one of these abstract concepts, that they had very much the notion of long-lastingness. But there's an enormous difference between something lasting for a very long time as compared to something lasting forever. And for them, the forever notion would mean death, because forever represents that kind of permanence, that kind of unchangingness, that for them meant non-existence rather than existence. Sorry. Yes?
That's what I'm confused also. Death is permanent. Wouldn't that mean eternity to them also, or was death a phase of transition also?
Yeah, that's, again, they had no sense that any of the various souls that we have, and it was not just one soul, you know, there was a Ba and a Ka, and the going up into the stars and being in the mummy and, you know, being part of Osiris and all of that, all those various ways in which our life continues after the death of our physical body here. But that, again, was not a notion that goes on forever. It's just a notion that it hasn't stopped yet. Do you see the difference? There really is no forever for the Egyptians. And to my mind, the pyramids are a good example of that. You know, I mean, that notion that those, you know, the way in which we know how those pyramids have lasted in a way that is absolutely stunning, right? But none of us would imagine them as lasting forever. They just last a whole lot longer than anything else we can think of that humans have made, right? And that, as I understand it, was the Egyptian conception of time. You know, being able to imagine that really big, big span. But I think that's very different from that abstract notion that eternity represents. Yes?
I can kind of see now why Moses wanted to get his people out of there. I mean, it was just so entirely different from the Hebrew
Yeah,
God.
right.
It's amazing. I had not really thought of that at all. I mean, it wasn't just because they were having such a lot of fun in Egypt, but because they were totally opposed to his religion.
Mm-hmm.
And he had to take them out of it for every sort of disaster.
Yeah. You know, one of my very favorite pieces of 20th century fiction is Thomas Mann's Joseph and His Brothers.
I read that.
Yeah. And that, of course, isn't focusing on the Moses period, but it is focusing on, or several of the volumes in it focus on Joseph's time in Egypt and his trying to somehow accommodate his family's traditions about the one God with what he's discovering in Egypt. And I think it's a beautifully told version of what that encounter is. Yes, Eleanor?
I have always been puzzled by our dollar bills. You know, our dollar bills always they have the pyramid with the eye on top. And I wonder what that's signifying.
I don't know. I mean, I do know that the founding fathers of this country were very interested in Rosicrucian and so on kind of symbolism, and I think it comes from there. But I mean, it's not anything I really know about. The Masons, yeah. That's true. Yes.
I'd be interested in hearing what you have to say about the relationship of the goddesses and the worldview you were discussing tonight to Egyptian monotheism. And that came up a few times during your history.
Well, as far as we know, there was really, before the Greco-Roman invasions, there's really only one period of monotheism in Egypt, and that's at the period of Akhenaten. And that was very strange, because actually during that period, Akhenaten was worshiping the sun, and his family were worshiping the sun. But that didn't mean that he expected the other Egyptians to worship the sun. The other Egyptians were supposed to worship him. It was only the members of his own family that had the privilege of worshiping the sun. And that revolution clearly felt so strange to the Egyptians that it completely disappeared after his death, and there was a lot of resistance to it, even during his lifetime, because the priests were never persuaded. I mean, they were losing their living anyway, And I've read quite a bit about Egyptian history, and mostly the books that I've read, both the books about mythology and the more historically oriented books, really end up sounding as though the authors are really puzzled by where Akhenaten came from. What led him to have this longing for there to be just one. When I was growing up, I read Breasted, and I don't know if any of you grew up on Breasted or not. One of the things that I was reminded of when I went to Egypt, I'd sort of forgotten that when I was a child, one of my great longings had been to go to Egypt sometime. In fact, it had been to grow up to be an archaeologist who could go and dig in Egypt, because all the things that I'd read about Egypt had just made it sound like, this was sort of the place, the beginning place, the way that I have rediscovered it to be. But I do remember reading Breasted, when I was a very young person. And Breasted's version of Egyptian religious history was that Akhenaten represents the beginnings of monotheism. And I think that most scholars today would say no, that Akhenaten was this little moment that had no consequences. There was a period, again, I don't remember just when it was, where, this is something Freud falls for. I mean, Freud wants to somehow relate Hebraic monotheism to some kind of Egyptian roots. And so you remember in Moses and Monotheism, he imagines that Moses had originally been a deputy of Akhenaten's, who, when Akhenaten died and his whole regime, was destroyed, that Moses took a few people out into the desert because he wanted to keep this monotheistic thing going. But almost every scholar whose work I tend to respect would now date Moses in the period of Ramses II, much, much later, and doesn't see any connection between Moses and Akhenaten. So I think that idea that Egypt was somehow the cradle of monotheism is not an accepted one anymore. Yeah.
I have kind of a dual question. One aspect is, you mentioned the dualism of the Egyptian two lands, and it didn't sound like quite the same concept as the dualism of, say, India and the Maya and the illusion and reality.
Oh, no.
Yeah, it sounded really different. And also, is there any similarity between the concept of Kali, the devouring goddess, the female destructive force of India, and this Sekhmet?
Yeah, I don't know if there is any kind of diffusion connection, or whether this is just something that arises spontaneously in different places. But yeah, I think that there are real connections between Kali and Sekhmet and an ancient Near Eastern goddess called Anath. So Yeah, so I think there are those connections. I think that one of the things I was trying to communicate about Egyptian dualism is that the Egyptians aren't really caught up in the kind of dualism that leads to polarized, oppositional, antithetical kind of thinking. For them, two is just the first time you got more than one. You know, two's the first time you got juice. And two then leads to three, leads to four, leads to five. You don't just get stuck with two. And I think it's a very different kind of dualism. Yeah.
What about the conception of Ma?
Excuse me?
Ma, the goddess Ma. When does that enter into it? It seems like, because that is more like an abstract
Yeah.
concept. And how does it work in with the other gods and goddesses in Egyptian mythology?
Yeah. Ma'at seems to come very late. And you're right. I mean, it's more abstract. It's more almost allegorical because she sort of represents order, balance, and so on. Doesn't seem to have been originally connected with the natural world. She seems to have been created by theological speculation. So one of the things that happens in Egypt is that after the kingdom gets unified, after there is an Egypt, after there are the two lands, after there is a pharaoh, the pharaohs establish a national priesthood. Because, of course, in Egypt, as almost anywhere in the world, anyone who wants to have a unified political order wants to have a unified religious order. And that's what those national priests were supposed to do. They were, and so a lot of they were the ones who did the writing. And a lot of their efforts were dedicated towards having, one religion that everything else would fit into. And it seems to be the case that the focus on solar deities is post-Pharaonic, and that all those solar deities, and there's a series of them. There's Atum, and there's Ra, and there's Amun, and so on. And different ones of them are more important at different historical epochs. But it seems to be the case that every one of them is either an import from elsewhere, particularly Mesopotamia, or is an invention of the priests. That it was not part of sort of the native, indigenous, early religion to be a sun-worshipping people. And it was one of the ways in which there was a male deity was made supreme over a situation where originally the most important divinities had been the local goddesses of each of the nomes. Yeah.
How did Muslims then take a hold and have this wanting to have the multiplicity of
Well, there are a lot of, but for that, Alexander conquered Egypt. And from thence forward until Egypt got conquered by Christians, was ruled by Greco-Romans. And some of the quite lovely temples that you see are temples that were built in the Greco-Roman period. The Greco-Romans tried to create a kind of much more unified, much more sort of ordered version of Egyptian mythology. Isis sort of became the goddess and absorbed all the other goddesses and was made into a figure much like Demeter. There are quite a few episodes in that Isis and Osiris story that Plutarch tells that weren't part of the Egyptian tradition at all. They're taken straight from the Demeter story and stuck into the Isis and Osiris story. There was for some reason I can't think of his name, but there was a god that was invented by the Ptolemies that became the most important god in that later Ptolemaic period. So Egyptian religion had really changed even before the Christians came. And one of the things that was, at least for me, among the most painful sights when we were in Egypt was to see the way in which the early Christians defaced the Egyptian temples. And in some ways painful, but also in a strange kind of way almost amusing too, because one of the things that they would do was when they came to the bas-reliefs, they scratched out all the figures of the gods and goddesses, because these were demonic, they were idols. And yet, with the scratching out, you can still see exactly where those figures had been, you know. And then at Karnak, there's a very strange representation where originally the god Amun, to whom that temple is primarily dedicated, had been standing with a goddess on each side. And so you had these three figures, the center one, the god, being the taller. And then what the Christians did was they chiseled away every part of those two goddess figures except their shoulders. And so what you ended up with was something looking like a crucifix. And then, you know, eventually Islam comes in, and, you know, Islam succeeds in Egypt in large measure because the Egyptians had been ruled in a way that was very exploitative and oppressive from Constantinople by Christians. And the thought of having a religion that was somehow a native religion from, you know, their part of the world had enormous appeal. And also, Islam, as you know, is a religion that, in a lot of ways, is much more simple and straightforward. The theology of it. I mean, there is one God. It's a monotheism in a way that's much clearer than Christian Trinitarian kind of thinking. Yes.
I'm curious about the way in which mankind was created by tears. I wonder if that has something to say about the nature of man.
Well, the way that I understood it was that it's a way of saying that there's pain in human life. And perhaps indirectly suggesting that that's one of the consequences of being the particular kind of beings that we are, that are conscious, you know, that can worry about the future and that can sadly remember the past. You know, it's so hard for us, given the kind of being we are, to simply live in the present, right? And that attunement to the future and to the past, that being able to imagine things different from the way they are now, which can either make the present seem empty compared to what it might hold, or can make the present seem painfully vulnerable in terms of how beautiful it is and yet how transient. I mean, just being the kind of beings that we are, I think, means that we live here in this world tragically. Yeah.
I've been to Egypt too, and I've got about 50 questions, but